Brothers, sisters, friends, we are gathered here today in this sacred space to mourn the passing of and celebrate the life and legacy of one Paul Ace Frehley, the original Spaceman of KISS. In his 75 years of life on this planet, Ace gave us scores of classic guitar licks and solos, produced a number of solid solo efforts independent of KISS, and forever altered the idea of what a showman guitarist could be. At least for me. When I was still a little kid getting into classic rock, Ace Frehley stood head and shoulders above the peers of his era for how flashy he'd make his performances while still losing none of his self-taught technical ability. Now, Ace was not a perfect person, and I'd be the first to tell y'all that, but at the height of his abilities, when he was really locked in, he was the perfect rock star, and I will miss him dearly. So today, I'd like to honor him by making public one of my Patreon-exclusive documentaries that I released ages ago during my first run of KISS Deep Dives. Granted, it's not entirely about him, as I also covered his feline compatriot Peter too, but I figured a retrospective covering their years that they went solo after 70s KISS and before the reunion would be as fitting a tribute as I can muster at the moment. I still got multiple pages of script to write for the finale of hair metal history, y'all. So, that being said, would someone please wheel that substitute teacher card in? Thanks. Sit down and enjoy my first Patreon-exclusive deep dive, The Long Wilderness of the Bad Boys of KISS. Oh, and if you like it, consider subbing to my Patreon for other exclusives. Anyways. As James Ambrose Johnson Jr. once famously stated, cocaine is a hell of a drug. Since the rise of drug smugglers in places such as Cuba, Chile, and most crucially Colombia in the back half of the 20th century, the Western world has delighted in the excess of the fine white powder, rich creatives especially. I'm sure you're already familiar with some of the most notorious cases of coke addiction in rock history: David Bowie, Eric Clapton, CeCe DeVille, Alice Cooper, Ozzy Osbourne, the entirety of Fleetwood Mac, the list goes on. While cocaine almost certainly was a creative muse for the lot of them, it also screwed them up mentally to the point where they grew withdrawn, isolated, amnesiac, paranoid, and in some cases openly Nazi. Many a band faced interpersonal drama owing to cocaine use, including good friends of the channel KISS. Now, as I detailed in my Fall of KISS series, you may have heard of it, both Peter Criss and Ace Frehley fell into a spiral of drug addiction owing to their extensive touring and recording commitments within the band, and their disappointment in the commercial direction the band had been taking. In fact, as Ace later recalled, being a coke addict only helped fuel other addictions.
The first time I ripped a few lines of blow, I felt like I discovered something almost as good as sex. My whole body came to life. It was a terrific buzz on its own, and in the beginning it gave me focus and clarity, but you know what I liked the most about coke? It made me a better drinker. I was already damned prodigious, but cocaine put me in a different league. It allowed me to drink longer and harder without passing out. What I discovered, what any connoisseur of cocaine discovers, is the remarkable ability of the human body to withstand abuse. Cocaine is a stimulant, alcohol a depressant. Used smartly, notice I didn't say intelligently, the two chemicals bounce each other out. It's almost like a speedball, the alcohol, or in the case of the speedball, the heroin, depressing the central nervous system and the cocaine jolting it back to life. Of course, I'd never done a speedball, never would have considered it. Mix heroin and cocaine? No fucking way. Too dangerous. People I knew had died from that concoction. You'd have to be out of your mind. But cocaine and alcohol? Oh yeah, all night long, baby.
These compounding addictions, combined with their anxieties, gradually broke both musicians down. Ultimately, it was one of the driving causes for their departure from KISS. Unfortunately, just because they were gone, doesn't mean their drug problems, or the mental problems that fueled or were exacerbated by them, went away. Both Ace and Peter continued on their own into the 80s, attempting to hit the same level of success they achieved within KISS, but the fading relevance of their former legacies, combined with their struggles with addiction, combined in such a way that hamstrung them for years to come. Honestly, there's a lot similar about their journeys during this time. By the mid-90s, both artists had cycled through a number of bands in an attempt to stay relevant in a world that was moving away from simple hard rock towards darker sounds like grunge and alternative metal. The key difference, ultimately, was that one went to rehab and faced the reality of his situation sober, while the other remained numbed on some drug or another well through that time, in spite of periodic attempts to get better. Join me for the next half hour or so as we take a deep-ish dive. I don't want to get too ahead of myself here. This video is only supplemental into the tragically unsuccessful solo careers of ex-Kiss members Peter Criss and Ace Frehley. After getting kicked out of Kiss, Peter Criss was not in the best of states mentally speaking, but he was enthusiastic to stick it to his former bandmates and strike out on his own. As his exit was being negotiated, he got together with his usual partner in crime, Stan Penridge, to write material for a new solo album. Once again, the two partied a bunch while writing the songs, but the album's creation wasn't derailed quite to the extent Criss's '78 solo album was. Also, like the solo album, Criss wanted to work with Vinnie Poncia again, but Poncia was already busy elsewhere. Instead, Criss brought on board producer David Wolfert, who was a producer for Paul Anka and Dusty Springfield. Yeah, not exactly inspiring confidence here that he's learned the mistakes from his first solo album, but in truth, Peter really didn't want to play heavy metal anymore. He wanted to prove himself as his own artist, to be another Sinatra. That being said, his autobiography seems to paint a different picture. Though he mentions he put together a band which he felt had a great Young Rascals-esque sound, Peter is also more confident that the direction the album took combined more soulful sounds with, and I quote, British metal. Someone called Blinks the Time Sweeper because that passage is about to be a poorly aged thing. Once the album was recorded, Peter decided to name it Out of Control, both after a song he'd written and recorded for it, and in reference to how Kiss had put him down in the past few years. Like, call me out of control, will ya? I'll show you who's boss. Peter wanted to use his face on the album cover, but Bill Aucoin and Howard Marks talked him out of it because Kiss were still semi-successful at this stage, and they didn't want the ex-Catman ruining the mystique so openly. Of course, that also comes with its own caveats, which I'll discuss more in a bit, but regardless, Peter had to get a new album cover. Peter came up with the idea for an exploding jukebox, which was elaborated on by commissioned artist Todd Shore. Shore, who would later become a distinguished surrealist artist in his own right. Man, if I had a nickel for every surrealist artist who worked with Kiss in some capacity, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice. Watercolored not only the scene Peter had conceptualized, but included a depiction of Criss's new playmate wife, Deborah Jensen, as well as a cute little Easter egg. So, $1,000,000 question. Is Out of Control actually an improvement on Criss's '78 solo album? Well, yes and no. Penridge and Criss once again create some damn catchy rockers, this time with Wolfert in tow. In Trouble Again, I Found Love, and the title track are probably the best examples of this, and some other cuts are fine too. The backing band Criss got really does have more bite than on his previous album. Unfortunately, this album isn't free of its cheesier R&B influences. There's Nothing Better is like a redux of Hooked on Rock and Roll. There's a cover of The Young Rascals' You Better Run, and it rocks decently, but then you got these cheesy synths interrupting.
I love you, girl, I love you so. Can you feel it? Don't you know? I can't stand your alibi. You're telling lies, you're driving wild.
Honestly, with the addition of more synths and the prominence of Benny Harrison on piano, the album sounds closer to Kiss's Unmasked than whatever sort of British metal Criss had on his mind at the time. Additionally, you have your standard Beth soundalikes in By Myself, Words, and Feel Like Letting Go, which all work well with Peter's voice. The former is kinda sentimental, obviously a song meant to reflect on Peter's departure from Kiss. But it does the album no favors as the opening track, or its lead single. Seriously, Kiss fans had already rejected an album like this 2 short years ago. What did Casablanca Records think would happen putting their softest foot forward first?
So in the end, when it came out on September 9th, 1980, Out of Control made practically no impact on the charts anywhere. I myself saw no success either. Peter, in the years since, has alleged that Casablanca, egged on by Kiss, blackballed the album and refused to adequately promote it. That may be true, that may not be, we may never know for sure. But in all fairness to Casablanca, 1980 in general was a turbulent year for them. Remember, they'd just been bought out and practically gutted and refitted by Polygram after spending excessively on drugs and promotional stunts throughout the 70s, so support for all of their artists, especially the ones who weren't guaranteed cash cows, was limited. Be that as it may, Peter still got some opportunities for publicity through the Howard Bloom organization, both in magazines and on TV. At first, Chris gave interviews with his back to the camera, as had been done in previous Kiss interviews, appearing on CNN after leaving the band. During the promotional cycle for his new album, however, he showed up on Tom Snyder, this time not bombed out of his mind and, more importantly, showing his makeupless face.
I'll tell you, the last time the guys were here, the only time that they were here, afterwards I said, these guys are really wacko. These people are not sane. Then afterwards the makeup comes off and here are four fairly respectable, sober, thinking, intelligent human beings.
Not all of us are sober, but...
Not all the time, but then again, who is?
I don't know.
No.
Well, okay, jury's out on the bombed out of his mind part, but he also showed up in November on the Robert Klein Hour with Deborah and two members from Blondie. Sadly, I can't seem to find that one on YouTube.
Regardless, none of these appearances seem to have done anything for Peter's fortunes. He tried to book a tour, but big venues wouldn't take him, let alone high school gymnasiums apparently, so he decided to just become a family man in the meantime. See, despite his departure from Kiss and the failure of his solo album, Peter was pretty well set. He still owned a 25% stake in Kiss and the money which came with that, which allowed him to afford a mansion in Darien, Connecticut. There, he and Deborah had a child together, Jenny Lee Chrysocolla, born on April 7th, 1981. The birth of his daughter was an emotional moment for Chris, but at the same time, it didn't stop his hard-partying ways, nor did it keep him and his wife reconciled for long. As he later reflected about this stage in his life, after a while, someone brought over a gram of coke and we did it, and before we knew it, we were back to our stupid drug ways. We'd put the kid to bed and break out the blow and champagne. During the week, I'd drive in and hang out at the Kiss offices. Hey, it was still 1/4 my office, and Bill was managing my solo career. Here comes the country squire, people would say when they saw me in the halls. I'd hang around the office for a while, then go out for a martini and have lunch at the Four Seasons or the Palm. Deb would drive in with me and she'd shop and then lunch at the Copacabana. We were both living in a bubble. Rock star / playmate. We had a part-time nanny and nothing else to do but shop, drink, get high, and throw parties. Amid this haze of excess, Peter remembered that he had a record deal with Casablanca he had to honor and decided to go once again into the studio in early 1982. Thankfully, this time, he got to reunite with another former partner in crime, Vinnie Poncia. Seems like Peter didn't hold a grudge over the whole replace him with Anton Fig thing during the Dynasty sessions. Really, with the desire to actually make his big break commercially for real this time, Peter trusted Vinnie with most of the album's creative decisions. Apparently, Stan Penridge was nowhere around at the time, and Peter was in no state of mind to write, so much like the '78 solo album, Poncia sourced a lot of the songs on Chris's next album from the outside. Instead, Chris mostly focused on improving his voice and saw a vocal coach around this time. After recording instrumentals with a variety of studio musicians in LA and Peter's vocal overdubs in New York City, the album was finally ready for a summer release and was given the title Let Me Rock You. The Kiss camp were even okay with Peter showing his face on the cover this time, although... Okay, I'm gonna come out and ask, who the hell was even asking for a Thirst Trap Catman pic circa 1982? Like, not even trying to body shame, but that's like thirsting for Ringo after, 1975. Sadly, the album was still screwed by the label. With the recent commercial failure of the latest Kiss album, Casablanca Records were in a very fragile position, and when presented with a new album from two-time bomb Peter Criss, balked at a full-scale release for it. Instead, they only released it in Europe as a test balloon, If it did well enough there, maybe it could see release in other markets. It did not see release in other markets. Though Casablanca released a single for it, which also bombed. 3 strikes and he was out. The Catman solo career was dead. And it's a goddamn shame it happened with this album too, because Let Me Rock You is legitimately a far better album than the first 2. The first half of the album is legitimately some good pop rock with great guitar work from such diverse musicians as Michael Landau, Steve Stevens, Steve Lukather, Caleb Quay, and Bobby Massano. 2 particular highlights are Tears, a lovely song by Adam Mitchell and future Ankh warrior Vinnie Cusano, which shows Pancha going full photograph in his production, and a cover of John Lennon's Jealous Guy, which is slick and a little funky too. In fact, Polygram agree with me since they released the 2 as a single in Europe. For as lively as the front half of the album is, the back half drags and is a bit more corny in the vein of Chris's first 2 outings. The title track and Bad Boys wander dangerously close to 50s pop revivalism for my tastes, though I admit Chris's rendition of Feel Like Heaven, his ex-bandmate Gene Simmons' recent disco rock composition, is a nice little pick-me-up and a side of otherwise less interesting material, helped along by an electric arrangement by Pancha.
I can make your heart pound. You can feel the beat. I can make the earthquake underneath your feet.
If there's any Peter Criss solo album I can recommend you check out after this video, it would be this one. The failure of Let Me Rock You sent Peter into a state of depression. Packing up his drum kit, he committed himself to being a good father to Jenny Lee, although that didn't stop him from continuing to consume cocaine like a Victorian child recovering from a painful mine accident. He grew paranoid and more erratic in his behavior, which eventually led to a dramatic arrest at his Darien mansion after a fight with an equally coked-out Sean Delaney, a temporary separation from Deborah, and a stint in rehab which brought Peter to the lowest point in his life when his distraught parents came to visit him. Criss did eventually get sober thanks to the program, but this was challenged when his partner in crime Stan Penridge once again came to him with another band called The Alliance. They never released anything and only played a few gigs, but this band sounds pretty decent from what demos do exist on YouTube. Unfortunately, it ended prematurely once Peter, after a drunk bender spent demoing with The Alliance, dropped out of a tour for supposedly hepatitis and never spoke with Penridge again. Criss still had the rock star life, the Connecticut mansion, the hot playmate wife, and the royalties from a previous success, but drugs sapped him of the drive, and it would take the cat some time to get it back. While fighting for his sobriety, Peter was dragged into financial uncertainty as the Kiss venture he was still entitled to a quarter of sank with the release of Music from the Elder and Creatures of the Night. So bad did his situation get that Criss took to hiring an Italian-American guy he refers to as Louis Vizzini to represent his financial interests and haggle for more money from Glickman Marx. Vizzini, according to Criss, lived in a Long Island house on the water, owned a bunch of expensive speederboats, cars, and statues, and had a guard standing around out front with a shotgun. Once under the Catman's employ, he acted vaguely threatening at a meeting with Howard Marks, convinced Criss and his wife to hand over thousands of dollars of their own money to reinvest it, helped Criss put his Darien mansion up for sale, and threatened to beat up a prospective Texan interested in the property, and it was only with that last incident that Peter began to suspect that he was in bed with the mob. Yeah, I've extended a lot of sympathy towards Peter Criss in the past, and will continue to do so where applicable, but I concede that he's not exactly the sharpest tool in the shed. Scared out of his wits and convinced by his wife to make a fresh start in a new but familiar place, Peter decided to move to Los Angeles in 1984, where he fucked around for a few more years in a cliffside house in Palos Verdes. I'm telling you guys, he had little musical drive at this time. At least he had a tight-knit little family, when he wasn't getting charged with third-degree assault for hitting his wife, at least. God, Criss was just doing no favors for himself in any press, rock or otherwise. Eventually, though, he grew bored, and after prodding some friends at A&M Studios, was directed towards an upstart band named Jane in the vein of the Pretenders that needed a drummer. The pairing of the Catman with this band reportedly gave them a harder edge, but his bandmates were far, far from the sorts of hard rockers Criss had worked with in the past. According to his biography, when he showed his new bandmates his framed gold and platinum Kiss records, Singer Jane Book naively asked Peter if they were ever bigger than the Bay City Rollers. Peter wouldn't answer, but if we're talking raw single success, needless to say, there was a schism that developed in Peter's new project from the start between he and the rest of the band, which was only further widened when they decided to name the band Balls of Fire. Really? That's the name you're going with? A phrase that immediately calls to mind a high-pitched cousin molester squawking the goofy-ass, "Goodness gracious, great balls of fire!" Like, for any rock band, that's a corny-ass name, but especially so for a band with their female-fronted rock sound. And honestly, what auditory evidence exists of this sound from the few gigs they played shows a pretty rockin' group that sounds a lot like Lita Ford, but unfortunately, well, Peter's fans weren't there for anything other than Kiss. This love for the drummer destroyed what goodwill was left between Peter and the rest of the act, leading to his departure after only a few shows. Even as general audiences generally grew bored of Kiss and the musicians they played with, Kiss diehards were asserting themselves as a powerful new force lurking in the shadows and demanding that Peter return to the past, in spite of the Catman's personal reluctance to do so. In fact, around this time, it seems like Kiss were also looking to bury their past, as their management went ahead and bought out Peter's 25% stake in Kiss. Though Kiss had at that point successfully reoriented themselves to the sound of the times, they were still a far cry from the financial juggernauts they had been in the 70s, and so, in the run-up to another, more commercial venture for the band, shall we say, they would seek to tie up financial loose ends and stop paying an ex-member who'd been out of the band for 7 years. While Kiss could afford to cut ties and focus in on expanding their brand, Chris was suddenly put into the position where he had to actually make money for the first time in years, a situation only further complicated when he fell into IRS troubles and suspected Deborah of siphoning his money from behind his back. Something Peter attempted to do at this time was write an autobiography he'd call A Face Without a Kiss. But when the ghostwriters he'd worked with couldn't quite get his Brooklyn-born personality right, the Cat scrapped the entire project. The autobiography, however, did get the Cat seriously reflecting on his life for the first time since at least rehab, in the form of tape dictations. We have at least one that remains preserved in Chris's future autobiography, and it's raw. You know, sometimes you can get real scared. You think you're lost, and you think it's over, man, and you figure the glory days are gone. And now I face the pressures of everyday living that I never knew about. Being in Kiss, it was always taken care of for me. Now that I'm a parent of a 5-year-old girl, I find that the stress is enormous. Sometimes I freak out at night and go out on my balcony, look out over the ocean and say, man, is it over? Do I still have it? Am I too old? I guess every man must ask himself these questions when he's struggling to get back on top of something he succeeded at. I want to make money and enjoy playing music at the same time. I get scared, man. I think maybe it's not going to happen for me again. I've got a young wife. I know she loves me, but I just get scared. All I know about is drums, man. That's all I've ever known, and that's what I do the best. You know, in sports, when you're a young, tough jock, you can do a lot of moves. When you get older, you can't do those moves. That's what happens to us in music, too. Especially drummers. It's such a physical instrument. But I am a survivor. I am a survivor. In spite of, or perhaps because of his growing self-doubt, it would take Peter another few years to start another musical project. Within that time, he would still record with other artists, but in more of a cameo capacity, appearing as a backing vocalist on King Cobra's third album and Black and Blue's Nasty Nasty. Fun fact, Gene Simmons produced Nasty Nasty, and despite some hesitation from Peter to come in and record for Gene, the Cat and Demon would get the vocal takes down and shoot the shit for another few hours. Also, this wouldn't be the last time Peter would go on to collaborate with both Simmons and Black and Blue's guitarist Tommy Thayer, but it sure as shit was the most amicable time. Speaking of collaborating with Kiss members, however, that is exactly what Peter did in 1989 when forming his next band. Peter linked up with Kiss's then most recent ex-guitarist Mark St. John to form the band Tree, later Keep, in addition to David Donato on vocals and Michael Norton on bass. St. John, Norton, and Donato had actually played together before in the glam metal act White Tiger, not to be confused with the other glam metal act from this time named after a big white cat, and in truth, The Keep was far more of their own project than Peter's. If you listen to the demos The Keep recorded in 1990, they sound heavily like a glam metal act. Hard riffs, ripping solos, and listen to the reverb on those goddamn drums. And I don't inherently have a problem with glam metal, but by 1990, because of its overexposure and oversaturation, more and more Americans did, and were looking for something new. They didn't have to look too much longer before, in 1991, alternative rock exploded, born on the backs of artists like R.E.M. and Nirvana. Suddenly, much like disco 10 years prior, glam metal was forced onto the margins as record labels began to prefer these newer, edgier sounds. Among those affected were The Keep, who, despite their lively demos, saw rejection from just about every major label under the sun. They didn't see much success playing live either, only playing one show at a drum clinic Peter Criss held at a California guitar center. Oh yeah, and that's another thing. Peter, possibly at Mark St. John's suggestion, began taking on more drum clinics at this time as a way of paying the bills. As Mark put it, Peter really didn't have any other option at the time to bring in a steady income, since The Keep wasn't getting any calls and Peter was still trying to support his daughter and ever-distant wife. The Catman faced some tough times ahead in trying to establish a new musical image for himself, but at least his reputation was such where he could teach the younger generations how to play for a paycheck. Peter seemed to finally find his footing in a solo music career. So naturally, it was time for him to lose it again. On New Year's Day of 1991, Peter's mom died of lung cancer, sending him into a state of shock as he attended the funeral and lamented his inability to be with her in her final moments. He had little time to mourn, however, as just that same week, Star magazine published a story which alleged that the Catman was a homeless alcoholic living on the streets of Santa Monica. In actuality, Star had interviewed 39-year-old Christopher Dickinson, who had been passing himself off as Peter Criss for years in order to extract favors. This included a bus ticket to Boston from aspiring actress Cheryl Thompson, who also alleged that she and Criss were involved in a relationship in the early 80s, when he would have already been with Deborah. Now this made for some spicy celebrity gossip, and talk show host Phil Donahue was quick to capitalize, inviting Criss onto his show to confront Dickinson. And oh man, did sparks fly.
You know, we've got two wives of Peter Criss saying you're full of them.
I love it. I expected that, though. I'm not surprised.
I mean,
he has a lot to lose.
We need Judge Wapner here. I can't. What's the matter?
What are they going to lose by suing?
A married man is not going to admit to an extramarital affair, number one.
Yeah, but you're the one.
Every wife would say that.
One.
Well, look at you and look at my wife, and let's face it.
Together with his lawyer Bob McMurray, Criss sued Star for millions. They ended up settling out of court, and Criss earned a substantial sum, but then the Catman learned that McMurray was fucking his wife. Jesus fucking Christ. Look, in the end, I don't care who was fucking who in this decades-old rock star marriage, but it's clear to me that Deborah and Peter should have broken up a long time ago. Peter would proceed to do just that, finalizing the separation in 1994. He was now a divorced dad living independently in a crummy Los Angeles apartment. With the walls closing around him, Criss tried his hardest to keep his music career going. He held out for The Keep, eventually finding a record label, but Mark St. John, sick of waiting around forever for a call that would never come, was ready to leave. Now, depending on who's telling the story, Peter either kicked a possible kid diddler out of his band or bitched to St. John about his lack of loyalty. Regardless, The Keep collapsed shortly after, and Peter, for the fourth time in 10 years, formed another band, eventually named simply Criss. Now, especially in the band's early days, its lineup was something of a revolving door of musicians Criss would write music with, including Canadian songwriter Phil Nero and a number of other guitarists and singers. Finally, by 1994, the lineup had solidified with Mark Tallman Montague on bass, Mike Angel McLaughlin on lead guitar, and Mike Stone on rhythm guitar, who, fun fact, would later go on to play guitar in Queensryche. In the intervening 3 years, Criss would tour the United States and get a record deal. However, the tours were in small, dinky bars, and the record label was an indie label called TNT Records, which hardly had the resources to promote their artists in the way Peter would have wanted. The band recorded an EP and by 1994 were in the middle of recording a studio album, Peter's first in over a decade. But Peter was miserable. Every bar gig, every weekend visitation from his daughter, every turnover in lineup made the Catman reflect on his own failures, the series of events which brought him from megastardom all the way back down to square one. Was this all that was left for him?
But things, as people of this neighborhood come out to take a look in the sunlight, they can see how bad it is. 4 homes lost in this one block alone. Reporting live from Granada Hills, I'm Chris Harris, Fox 11 News. Back to the newsroom.
In the wee hours of January 17, 1994, a 6.7 magnitude earthquake hit Los Angeles. Within hours, 60 people were killed, 9,000 were injured, and the surrounding area suffered $13 to $50 billion in property damages, making it one of the costliest earthquakes in American history. Amid the chaos was Peter Criss, who would come to find his Los Angeles apartment in ruins in the aftermath. The framed Kiss records, most pictures of Jenny Lee, and even his People's Choice Award for Beth, all shattered. None of his utilities worked, his kitchen had become a rancid mess, and his bedroom was in shambles. Sitting by himself in the middle of his tarnished home, his tarnished life, the Catman decided that he had nothing else to live for. Peter grabbed a .357 Magnum, stuck it in his mouth, and cocked it. He was under no influence of drugs or alcohol. He still drank from time to time and smoked pot, but now, facing the collapse of his entire reality, Peter was stone-cold sober. Suddenly, however, he noticed a picture of Jenny Lee, undamaged by the earthquake. Taking it as a sign from God, Peter just barely backed away from the edge, taking the gun out of his mouth and locking it up. No, he would not die. Not today. Not when he still had a kid to raise. Not when he still had a solo career to fight for. Eventually, Criss dropped their first album on TNT Records, Cat No. 1, on August 16, 1994. The album art for this one is kind of funny in an ironic way. Peter spent so long after his departure from Kiss trying to distinguish himself as his own artist, as a musician with an identity apart from the Catman. But now here he is with half his face decked out in his classic makeup pattern, as though to extend an olive branch to the former Kiss fanbase he'd previously distanced himself from. And to be fair, Peter would need all the visual appeal he could get, because God knows TNT was barely doing shit to help move units. He would have to do most of the marketing for the album himself, going on tour once again with his band, and even making a few appearances at Kiss conventions which were popping up around this time. Though welcomed like a king at some shows, and especially at the conventions, Peter just could not convince people to give his solo career another chance. And truthfully, I do understand why. Personally, I think Cat No. 1 is a great album with a lot of inspired songwriting and emotion. More than on his previous albums, Peter leaned into the autobiographical more for his song's subject matter this time, reflecting on his divorce, his mother's death, and his imposter scandal in songs like Good Times, Blue Moon Over Brooklyn, and Bad Attitude, respectively. And while the rest of the tracks are a bit less so, they're still carried by some rockin' instrumentals provided by Criss's backing band. Hell, Montague and Stone even get their moments to shine on vocals, delivering their own distinct belts on Show Me, Strike, and We Want You. This is certainly the most Kiss-like album Peter Criss would ever make, aided by the fact that it literally ends on an intimate acoustic cover of Beth, the first song Criss ever wrote as the Catman. The problem is, though, the general public did not want a Kiss-like album by 1994, a fact that the actual Kiss were in the middle of reckoning with themselves. Cat No. 1 is a good-sounding album with some great emotional beats, sure, but it sounds at least 10 years out of date. It's yet another great bit of irony to come out of this part of the story. By the time Peter was finally willing to embrace the rock sound which propelled him to the top before, general audiences had moved on from it to something heavier still. And so, Peter was stuck. He continued touring the United States with Criss into 1995, even began incorporating more classic Kiss tunes and early solo material into his set. But it was still just miserable. They were still playing small gigs to crowds more excited to hear old Kiss cuts than anything they'd written. Peter does try to spin it the best he can in his autobiography, but the stories he tells around this time just make him come off as jaded and bitter, including a number of instances where he feuded with his tour managers over the food he was provided with. And yes, that's managers. The band would regularly fire them, tell them to pack their bags, and put them on a bus back home in a method they called the Greyhound treatment. Man, and Peter wonders why he was unable to gain much momentum. Peter was still alive, he still had his daughter, he still had his solo career, but it felt to him like he had nothing. His sobriety was tested. Reportedly, he'd need a few rolling rocks some nights to deal with the demoralization of playing to small crowds and, sadly, the death of his father. But somehow, whether it was because he wanted to do right by his daughter, honor his parents, or just face his reality with a clear mind, he never fell back into drug addiction. The cat was out there raw-dogging reality, and he was exhausted. One day, though, Peter learned of another Kiss convention taking place in Los Angeles on June 17th. Feeling nostalgic and wanting to share with his daughter his glory days, Peter looked into how he could attend. Gene Simmons, catching wind of this, would reach out to the Catman with an interesting proposition. Join Kiss on stage for Hard Luck Woman.
Remember earlier, we were saying that without the four original guys, we would never be here today. Remember when we were talking about everybody? Remember we were talking about Peter and Ace? Well, we thought it might be something special, but something really deserved. I mean, you deserve this, and it's going to be a kick for us. We thought Peter could come out and sing a couple of songs. So we're going to bring Peter. Where's Peter? Here comes Peter Chris.
Pause. Rewind. After leaving Kiss, Ace Frehley was not in the best of states mentally speaking, but he was enthusiastic to stick it to his former bandmates and strike out on his own. The only problem was, he was too distracted by his ever-debauched lifestyle. In the months before and after leaving Kiss, even though Ace was insistent that he either had to strike out on his own or die a miserable death, his musical output was non-existent, and he only made a single appearance playing guitar for Wendy O. Williams on an album produced by, ironically, Gene Simmons. His lack of extrication from his former bandmates wasn't from lack of trying. Apparently it took a few more years before Ace formally left the Kiss partnership he'd signed on to in 1980. Most of his time in this period was spent nursing his alcohol, cocaine, and, especially after his car accident the previous year, prescription medication addictions. It was this cantankerous cocktail of drugs which resulted in another DUI incident even more insane than the last. On May 22, 1983, Ace and a friend were driving home high in a DeLorean when, suddenly, the Spaceman lightly rear-ended a car in front of him in plain view of a cop car. When the cop came over to ask Ace for his license and registration, Ace, who'd left it at home, knew he was fucked, so he went for broke, kicking his friend out of the car and gunning it down the Bronx River Parkway. He was running red lights, speeding into traffic at 60 miles per hour, bouncing off of other cars and embankments, and apparently running people off the road in an attempt to beat his arrest, and good God, he actually nearly did it. Now, despite its amazing aesthetic, the DeLorean has never been particularly known for its performance. Hell, it was one of the reasons the car ended up such a financial failure in the end. But when Ace shifted that baby into fifth gear, those cops saw some serious shit. Not only did Ace pass 88 miles per hour, he was estimated to have hit goddamn 90. After traveling to the future, or at least to a nearby deli, the Space Ace attempted to report the car as stolen and have a friend pick him up, but the bewildered deli owner, noticing Ace's smoking DeLorean outside, called the cops. Within minutes, Ace was arrested and sent to jail. Though he'd be released on bail, his license was revoked, he was fined $600, and he was ordered to a few weeks of mandatory detox and AA meetings. The incident was also well publicized in an AP wire that went out across the country in the weeks after. Ace's reputation as a drunk, which had been before confined to speculation, was now national news. And still, he would not sober up. Ace steadily worked on new songs in his home studio, even got together a rough track list for another solo album, but his focus inevitably wandered back to fishing and partying with his friends. In the next few months, he would almost run down a traffic cop while blasted, get arrested by federal narcotics agents and thrown in Westchester County Jail for faking a prescription for cough syrup, and ultimately decided to check himself into rehab only when his coke dealer got busted by DEA agents and he grew paranoid that they would come after him next. After spending a month in Silver Hill Hospital, Ace left with a completely clean body for the first time in years. Unfortunately, his antics had grown too much for his wife Jeanette at this time, and truthfully, I don't blame her. Jeanette wasn't sober herself, but she was at least a functional parent to her and Ace's 4-year-old daughter Monique. Meanwhile, no one, not even Ace himself, was sure if he'd be walking as a free man or even living for much longer. Ace moved out of his residence in Wilton into a Manhattan apartment with a renewed sense of purpose. This time, for sure, he would launch his solo career. The first call he made, of course, was to his good friend and drummer Anton Fig, who immediately accepted the gig. He would also bring aboard up-and-coming guitarist and secondary vocalist Richie Scarlett, as well as bassist John Regan and keyboardist Arthur Stead, both formerly of Peter Frampton's backing band. Inspired by the imminent approach of Halley's Comet, Ace had the idea to name an album Fraley's Comet, but then decided it would sound even better as a band name. Together, this first incarnation of the Comet would demo a number of songs and play a few gigs in the tri-state area between 1984 and 1985. Sadly, I can't find very many of the demos on YouTube, but there's at least one gig which was apparently filmed in 1984 which shows this lineup in great form, not only sounding sharp as hell on Ace's earlier solo tracks and even a rendition of Cold Gin, but showcasing several new tracks as well which sound absolutely massive yet raw and ripping in the live setting. In other words, Ace was acclimating well to the arena sounds which defined heavy metal for most of the 80s, which makes perfect sense seeing as how Kiss with Ace at the helm practically laid the groundwork for arena rock. The only real song that feels out of place at these early gigs is a ballad titled Back Into My Arms Again, which isn't a bad song necessarily, but in the middle of all the wall-to-wall rockers, it's just awkward and demands a little more punch, perhaps. Still, Fraley's Comet had a solid repertoire. They just needed a record deal, which proved surprisingly hard to nail down, but not entirely surprising given the Spaceman's shaky record in recent years. A number of major labels rejected Ace's band, and a deal with UK-based label Bronze was on the table until they folded in 1986. While demoralizing for his bandmates, both Scarlett and Stead would leave during this period, the ordeal was even worse for Ace, who grew depressed at his situation and fell back into old addictions to cope. Thankfully, there was one music industry person who was still willing to go to bat for the Space Ace, Eddie Trunk. Now, say what you will about Trunk today. As a radio personality, he definitely has a tendency to run his mouth off with musical opinions clearly tainted by his biases. But in the mid-80s, he was quite influential in giving heavy metal a larger platform as an A&R employee and, eventually, vice president at Megaforce Records. Megaforce were then a burgeoning label, taking off after the success of their first act, Metallica, and signing artists like Overkill, King's X, and Anthrax. To Trunk, who was a Kiss diehard, Fraley's Comet was perfect for the heavy label, and so he convinced its president, John Zazula, to give Ace a shot. Soon, Fraley was back in the studio with both Anton Fig and Eddie Kramer, as well as the rest of the band, but, well, just what that band was constantly in flux. After the departure of Scarlett and Stead, Fraley brought in Rob Sabino on keys, who left pretty soon after, and then Todd Howarth, recently departed from a brief stint in Cheap Trick, on keys and rhythm guitar. And then, to make matters even worse, Anton Fig was poised to quit the band after being hired as the drummer for David Letterman's house band. Worse for Ace, I mean, not for Anton. Anton would go on to have a steady gig on late-night TV for the next 30 or so years.
It's a very nice surprise. What have you been up to?
Well, I've been over there playing drums with the band most of the time.
And what brings you here tonight?
Well, I wanted to remind the people that I have something special coming up on NBC tomorrow night.
Oh, really? What is that?
Well, I'll be over there playing with Paul and the band.
In the meantime, though, he was still kind enough to help Ace finish the album. Once complete in 1987, Fraley's Comet's self-titled debut would be released on April 27th.
Was it a debut befitting the Space Ace?
Well, kinda. There's not that much connecting tissue between the 78 solo album and the material on this album, aside from Fig's drumming, a few cool riffs on songs like Love Me Right, Calling to You, and Breakout, the latter of which was a reworking of Ace's jams with Eric Carr during The Elder, and a sequel to Fractured Mirror, titled in the vein of the very best Hollywood sequels, Fractured 2. Whereas the 78 solo album is a more timeless record because of Eddie Kramer's acoustic-focused production, Fraley's Comet sounds more like a product of its time, what with its heavily reverberant drum sound and keyboard layering. Think the difference between pre-87 Whitesnake and post-87 Whitesnake. The band, as I mentioned, leans hard into the arena rock vernacular of the day, especially when Ace lets Todd Howarth take the mic. Nothing against Howarth personally, his songwriting contributions are quality enough, but voices like his were a dime a dozen in 80s rock. Now when the album rocks, it fucking rips. Tracks like We Got Your Rock, Ace's cover of another Russ Ballard song, Into the Night, and the aforementioned Love Me Right and Breakout are personal highlights. But honestly, you can still sorta tell Ace wasn't on his A game. He's listed on most tracks as a co-writer, and the tracks which he did write himself, Stranger in a Strange Land and Dolls, are probably the weakest on the album. The former feels so much like filler, while the latter is just... what? Like, the creepy doll subject matter worked for Ozzy because he clearly had a tenuous grasp on insanity. But when old soft-spoken Ace does it, he comes off as a doll-collecting serial killer. And then there's Rock Soldiers, which... okay, so this'll probably be a controversial opinion since this song is probably the most enduring song from the Fraley's Comet period. Hell, Ace literally dedicates 2 pages in his autobiography to its lyrics. But I don't really like this song. Sure, that chorus is infectious and undeniable, and the central groove underpinning the song is powerful in that Bonham-esque way. But the subject matter is intensely frustrating. Ace wrote the song with Chip Taylor of Wild Thing fame and intended it to be a cautionary tale about rock star excess and drug addiction by amalgamating his multiple DUI incidents into a story about the Spaceman fighting the devil's temptation. As Ace would later put it, "That song is my message to the youth of America. That's not the way to go. At the time I was going through a very stressful period of my life. That day I cracked. I thank God that I didn't hurt myself or anyone else." But, as we know now in hindsight, despite his promises to never DUI again, Ace would still drunkenly get into trouble with police and nearly get busted smuggling drugs into another country, according to his autobiography.
You had made a lot of changes in your life. Yeah. Are you sticking with that and living by that? I don't drink and drive anymore.
Ace was already back into his drug addictions by the time Fraley's Comet came out, and wouldn't get completely clean for another few decades, and okay, sure, that's his prerogative, but with all the patting himself on the back for turning his life around after this song came out, I can't help but cringe when Ace delivers lines like, "If the devil wants to play his card game now..."
He's gonna play without an ace in his deck.
Not to mention, he has this sort of loose 80s white boy rap flow going on in the verses, like he's about to show up on West End Girls, and I can't take it seriously at all. Rock Soldiers is theoretically a great song, but it is aged poorly. Kind of like the rest of the album in some respects. It is nice that, in his sobriety nowadays, Ace can truly take the song's message to heart, and he still plays it regularly live as a reflection on his many years of excess. Still, Fraley's Comet was a moderate success. It just broke into the Billboard Top 40 and spawned music videos for Rock Soldiers and Into the Night, which would see some rotation on MTV. There was a lot of demand for the Spaceman's solo career compared to his feline compatriot. Ace and his band had a number of promotional opportunities and interviews, including a hosting gig with John Regan on MTV's Headbangers Ball.
This hour we
we have videos from Anthrax, YNT, and Kiss. Let's kick it off with a band who opened for the Motley Crue tour. Now, rock and roll!
More importantly, Fraley's Comet hit the road in the summer, hiring Billy Ward, no, not that one, as a replacement drummer. Unfortunately, neither situation was sustainable. Though the Comet had a decent summer solo tour and opened for Alice Cooper in the fall, they were prematurely dropped from their opening gig for financial reasons. Additionally, Billy Ward was too jazzy for John Regan, so he was dropped and replaced with Jamie Oldacker, longtime drummer for Eric Clapton. Even with as strong a start as they could manage, the band's momentum began to lag by early 1988. The removal from the Alice Cooper tour was a harsh blow, but then Megaforce put out a live EP in February which, even with a new studio cut, only peaked at number 84 on the Billboard charts. Clearly, the band had to record a follow-up, and fast. Said follow-up, Second Sighting, would release on May 24th. And let me just say this right off the bat, this album is a downgrade. Ace couldn't think of many ideas for songs, so Howarth fills half the album with his, and the contrast between the two's evolving styles is night and day. Whereas Ace takes a more bluesy, no-nonsense attitude to his contributions as seen on Insane, Juvenile Delinquent, Separate, and the closing instrumental The Acorn is Spinning, Todd Howarth goes full 80s stadium rock. Immediately after Insane ends, for instance, you're just hit by this wall of synths and chugging electric guitar in Howarth's Time Ain't Running Out, and it's just... At his best, he blends with Ace to create something tough like Loser in a Fight. At his worst, though, he contributes a full-on power ballad in the form of It's Over Now, which is just... I mean, it's not a bad song, but this was during the period of glam metal where every band and their mother was recording a power ballad to release as a single, so it's just a horrible stylistic choice for the album. It's like inside this band was two wolves, one that wanted to be Night Ranger and one that wanted to be Rat. Surely this wasn't sustainable, and neither was Jamie Oldacker as the drummer. Don't get me wrong, he does his best for sure, especially on The Acorn is Spinning, but the album loses something without Ace locking in with the rhythms of Ant and Fig. Shit, there's even a goddamn track on here, Dancing with Danger, that uses a goddamn drum sequencer, and it's just an atrocity, like, seriously, oh my god! Unsurprisingly, such a mixed album received a mixed reception, only peaking at number 81 on the Billboard charts at its height. The band did film videos for Insane and It's Over Now and host Headbangers Ball again, but for the most part, their television publicity was petering out. They were lucky enough to secure an opening slot for none other than Iron Maiden on their Seventh Son of a Seventh Son tour. It must have been an ironic moment for Ace, you know. Maiden opened for his former band just 8 years prior, and now here he was in the opposite position. Unfortunately, the situation was again unsustainable, as the tour lost them money, especially as Iron Maiden cancelled shows and Fraley's Comet were left to pick up their own tab. On the final night of their opening gig, August 2nd in New Orleans, Ace went back to his hotel room, drank, and sedated himself. His recent solo venture was failing, it seemed. His negative thoughts soon became suicidal. However, drawing upon his religious upbringing, Ace reached for a hotel Bible to read his favorite passages to calm himself. The night passed, and Ace, though broken up by his failure, was alive. Though it's possible all this sent him down a further spiral. In 1989, whether it was Megaforce or Ace himself, someone decided to change tactic and focus on Ace Frehley as a solo artist. The Fraley's Comet moniker was dropped, which signaled to Todd Howarth that it was perhaps time for him to bow out. In his stead, Richie Scarlett returned alongside Ant and Fig. The new Ace Frehley band went into the studio with Eddie Kramer to record a new album, which released later that year as Trouble Walkin'. Actually, this one has a number of guests, too. There's 3/4 of Skid Row and the familiar Cat on backing vocal duties, as well as drummer Sandy Slavin, who would become Ace's permanent drummer after Anton once again went back to Letterman. But having all the star talent in the world on your album is one thing. How are the songs? Whoa! Yeah, there's a lot of really good shit here. It's far and away the most rockin' album Ace has made since his '78 solo album, brimming exactly with the energy he brought to Colgate Mansion right from the jump with Shot Full of Rock. Other tracks like 5-Card Stud, Lost in Limbo, Trouble Walkin', and Back to School are similarly rockin'. There's a bit more of a pronounced blues influence here, which is especially apparent on the shuffling Remember Me, which was co-written by the goddamn English voice actor for James, Meowth, and Professor Oak in the Pokemon anime. I am not making this up. There's another cool Fractured instrumental, and Richie Scarlett even gets a little vocal moment to shine on Too Young to Die. Why, I'm not sure, but it doesn't ruin the song. Honestly, some of the weaker tracks on here, well, not necessarily weaker, just less good, are the covers like Ace's version of The Moves' Do Ya, or Desmond Child and Paul Stanley's open source Bon Jovi sound-alike Hide Your Heart. They're fun versions, if a little less rockin', and especially in the latter song's case, just lacking the same energy as Ace's co-writes on this album. And actually, the latter song was one source of controversy between Ace and the Kiss camp at the time. In the Spaceman's words, "I also invited Eric Carr to play drums on one track and he instantly accepted. He was really excited about the prospect of working with me again. Unfortunately, a few days later, I received a phone call from Eric, who sounded very upset. He informed me that Gene and Paul were opposed to the idea. Therefore, he had to regretfully decline the invitation. I was also upset, as Eric's situation brought back unpleasant memories of how fucked up they could be at times. During the mixing process, I received an interesting phone call from Gene Simmons. I couldn't believe he had the balls to request that I take my version of Hide Your Heart off the record. His reasoning was that they had recorded a version of it as well, and were planning on releasing it as the first single off the new album. I informed him that I had invested a lot of time and money in the recording process, and was thrilled with the results, so I wasn't about to entertain his request. I was dumbfounded. Unfucking believable. And unfortunately, Ace's woes with the album didn't end there. Trouble Walkin' would only peak at number 102 on the Billboard charts. The general public had grown weary of the Space Ace, it seemed. This resulted in his being dropped by Megaforce, which Fraley was literally numb to from all the drugs that were swirling around in his body. He played a few months of shows in support of Trouble Walkin' in early 1990, but at considerably smaller venues than he was playing with Fraley's Comet. The true canary in the coal mine moment occurred following the end of the tour when John Regan, Fraley's longtime bassist since the very earliest days of Fraley's Comet, moved on from working with Ace, fed up with the Spaceman's mounting drug problems and needing to earn a better living. Ace, meanwhile, continued to sink lower. There is an immense contraction of time after Trouble Walkin' in Ace's autobiography. In one paragraph, he condenses 2 tours over a period of 4 years, and then goes on to relay one incident of getting in trouble with the law that occurred in that period before moving on to 1995, and it's like, there's something missing here. The truth is, at this time, Ace was struggling, not only with addiction, but with getting another record deal. He was always optimistic in interviews around this time that he loved his band and he'd been writing enough material for another album, and surely it'd be released just around the corner, but it was now the early 90s. Kiss was increasingly uncool amid the increasing demand for alt-rock, while Ace was perfectly content to down a few beers and pills and play club to club for crowds of adoring fans demanding his old Kiss and solo tunes.
What really gets me off today and what gets my adrenaline pumping is the audience, and performing, the oldies, the goodies, and the new stuff. And I'm enjoying myself more now than I ever have in the past. And it's a great feeling, and as long as I enjoy playing rock and roll and running around the world, I'll continue to do so.
It wasn't enough to attract the attention of any label, even indie ones. Ace was coasting off of his old successes, and letting drugs carry him the rest of the way. Eventually, he did get serious about recording new material again and tried, apparently, to get sober again, demoing a few songs to send to labels by the fall of 1995 that his band had in the works since 1994. This included a song named Sister, which wouldn't be recorded for an album for another long while, but it definitely kicked ass when they played it live. If there's something you can't fault Ace for, it's his ability to assemble a great live band. But the interviews from around this time are interesting. There's this interview from the tapes archive from 1994 where Ace talks about his attempts at sobriety, his opinions on grunge, and, no doubt a topic of great interest at the time, Kiss nostalgia. That summer, Kiss My Ass Classic Kiss Regrooved had been released, a tribute album to Kiss featuring some of the hottest acts of the day like Lenny Kravitz and Stevie Wonder, Garth Brooks, Anthrax, and Dinosaur Jr. Meanwhile, the Kiss conventions were on the rise, both unofficially and eventually officially. At one point in the interview, Mark Allen, the interviewer, asks Ace if he's been in contact with Gene and Paul lately. And he says this.
I'm good friends with Peter. I just finished playing 3 guitar solos on his new CD. Recently, I spoke to Paul and Gene on a conference call, and we kind of buried the hatchet. It was a nice phone call. I apologized for quitting the group. Gene said to me, "Wow, you sound different." I said, "Well, that's because I'm not drunk."
Yeah.
Who knows what will happen in the future.
Would you consider going back with them in some capacity?
That's up to them. They own the name, and they'd have to approach me if it was, how should I say? If it was offered to me in the proper way, and it was a fair deal, I would seriously consider it.
Pause. Rewind. There's one more thread I want to follow before this video ends, and that's the relationship between Ace Frehley and Peter Criss. Much in the way Gene and Paul have been positioned historically as a duo, as two sides of the same business-centered, spectacle-focused coin of Kiss, Ace and Peter have traditionally been seen as the sex, drugs, and rock and roll part of the band, embodying the best, and worst, of rock's excesses. Naturally, the two gravitated towards each other even when they'd left Kiss, and though their friendship has been considerably tested, it has stood the test of time far longer than their friendships with their other ex-bandmates. The two partied a bunch together both within and without Kiss. After Peter left, since he basically lived 15 minutes away from Ace in Connecticut, the two would hang out together, spending time either at Ace's place or down at the YMCA playing sports while high as shit. It was here where Ace would vent to Peter about the creative decisions Kiss were making, such as the Elder debacle, and the two bonded further over their shared distaste for Gene and Paul's harebrained schemes. It seemed they valued each other's company as two musicians that, despite their two different conceptions of good rock and roll music, were essentially Kiss fans jaded by the decline of their once favorite band. But then, when both fell on hard times with drugs, they sorta drifted out of each other's lives for some time. Peter got clean and moved out to California, while Ace attempted to get clean and get Frehley's Comet off the ground, so they weren't exactly on the same track. Eventually, however, their paths crossed again when, during a Frehley's Comet gig in Los Angeles on August 23, 1987, Peter Criss was invited to attend by Ace and called on for a performance of Deuce. Criss was hopeful that this cameo, which was around the time Frehley's Comet were in between drummers, would lead to a drumming gig in the band, but was saddened when Ace went with Jim Oldecker instead. He'd later voiced these frustrations in an interview the following year while his autobiography was still on his mind.
Ace now has his own band. You'd think he would have at least called me to offer me the gig out of respect, just out of fun. Call Line of Pieces with Paul. He says, "You know, that scumbag." I went the night when I played with him. Carl Knight said, "I thought, of course he's getting rid of that guy. It's obvious Peter Criss is going to be now the drummer." At least even offered me to play on a song on his album. I mean, at least say, Peter, because I would to him. That's right. Today I would. Yeah. Now I won't.
All right. I do understand his mindset, given how much importance the Cat places on loyalty. Plus, as we've seen with his demos from The Keep, he was more than capable of playing the sort of stadium rock Frehley's Comet were putting out. At the same time, it was a rather presumptuous attitude for him to have, given their infrequent interactions in the previous few years, and I feel like Peter should have checked in with his friend more now that he was the sober one of the two, instead of hoping to ride his coattails. At the same time, he doesn't seem to have held a grudge over it for too long. In a 1988 interview with Frehley's Comet, Ace reveals he'd talked with Peter recently about his autobiography and learned the Cat planned on saying nothing negative about him.
Peter, to be totally honest with you, I called up Peter when I found out he was writing a book, and I said, Peter, you know, what are you going to write about? You know, and there's a lot of things I really don't want everybody to know. He said, Ace, you have nothing to worry about. Paul and Gene, on the other hand. So,
we should
me and Peter are old buddies. We've always remained friends through all the bullshit that went down. And I'm not worried about anything in the book, but other people might have to.
Plus, starting only a year later, the two began collaborating on each other's solo work when Ace reached out to Peter to come sing backing vocals on a number of tracks on Trouble Walking. Probably the best example of this collab is on the title track, where Peter and Ace belt the choruses together with great enthusiasm. Apparently, Peter also contributed percussion on the album too, but it's not clear where. Regardless, Ace would reciprocate the favor a few years later when Peter was recording Cat No. 1, contributing lead guitar work to Bad Attitude, Blue Moon Over Brooklyn, and Walk the Line, the latter of which shows him at home overtop Peter's funky rhythms. The evidence here shows that clearly there was still value from bringing the Catman and Spaceman together in one place, even if neither could reach the same heights they had previously hit with the ruthless business model of Kiss. One of them was sober and miserable, while the other was an addict but satisfied with his lot in life. But what if the two of them got together for a tour? Starting in May of 1995, at the behest of Ace's new touring manager, George Sewitt, Ace and Peter paired together for a string of dates for the rest of the year in Canada and the United States. Given their past reputations, it made sense to dub this the Bad Boys of Kiss tour. Right away, the difference in their touring philosophies for the past few years made itself apparent. According to Peter, "We had trouble right off the bat. Ace refused to open for us, so we went on first. But then we were supposed to come back on after 3 songs and do 3 songs together. That first night, Ace was on the 6th song and they hadn't called us up. Tallman went ballistic on Sewitt's ass. He was screaming at Sewitt and I was standing behind him smiling and saying, 'Look what you get, George.' From then on, we came on after Ace's 3rd song and did Hard Luck Woman, Strange Ways, and then ended with Rock and Roll All Night. I hated that idea. Why were we doing Gene and Paul's fucking song? Were we that hot up for applause?" But Sewitt was smart. 80% of Ace's set was Kiss songs. That's what the audience was really there for. We did all originals, so we didn't get the same response. Whereas Ace had been content to largely play his old Kiss tunes for fans who were sick of Gene and Paul, sprinkled in with some highlights from his solo albums here or there, Peter had only recently been incorporating more Kiss material into his set lists, preferring to let his band speak for themselves. Meanwhile, Ace's drug problems once again resurfaced. Peter noticed Ace drinking and doing drugs on tour, even downing cans of rum on stage, and realized that his band were enablers because they worshipped him, so to speak, much in the way Peter's bandmates did him. Even years after they removed their makeup, they were still rock icons to the musicians they were taking on tour with them, and that came with both its benefits and faults. The benefits are in how these bands sound. You go back and listen to some of the performances from both bands and they're very locked into both Ace and Peter. And especially when Ace joins Peter or vice versa, there's a chemistry on that stage that electrifies the crowd. As a novelty tour riding off the recent mid-90s wave of Kiss nostalgia, the Bad Boys tour was definitely a fun time for most involved. I have no doubt those who attended treasure those concert memories fondly. But it sure as hell wouldn't make the Cat or the Space Ace megastars again. If anything, it only seemed to confirm to Peter and Ace that people viewed them as little more than an extended Kiss tribute act. And as the tour progressed, the Bad Boys were approached by Kiss to make an appearance at a Kiss convention in July. Unfortunately, it conflicted with their touring itinerary, but then an even more ludicrous offer was floated by them: MTV Unplugged. You know how MTV Unplugged back in the day used to let artists invite guest musicians onto their Unplugged program? Think 10,000 Maniacs and David Byrne, or Nirvana and the Meat Puppets. Well, MTV wanted Kiss to appear on the program, and they wanted the original members to reunite.
We got some members of the family here tonight. And we're not talking about mom and dad. We're talking about Peter, Chris, and Ace Frehley.
Pause. Stop. Listen, I don't mean to tell these stories of failure and addiction to disparage Peter Criss or Ace Frehley. As we've seen, they were capable of some amazing things after leaving the band which made them household names. But the power of their former personas was so great, it was inevitably the crutch which they needed to fall back on for any commercial prominence. I don't think it's coincidence that the biggest marketing draw Peter had in his early days was removing the makeup, that Ace turned to a space-themed solo band before just playing Kiss songs on club tours, that even Peter, Mr. Wannabe Sinatra himself, would embrace his former Catman aesthetic for attention, that both of their backing bands were largely just happy to be on stage with rock legends and left any drug abuse by the wayside. Even though they were free of Kiss, Ace and Peter were not free of the music industry and market forces which determined their worth as solo musicians in the wake of the glam metal and, eventually, grunge eras. It pushed them into horrible mental states and, at their absolute worst, drug abuse, such that by the time their ex-bandmates came to them with the MTV offer, they were hardly the same people behind the Catman and Spaceman makeup that they were in their heyday, musically or emotionally speaking. I've extended a lot of sympathy to both of them in this video, and I still hold them in far higher regard than Gene and Paul, but their fame and fall from it made them do some stupid, even deplorable shit. All that is important context for the future of their careers, because after the inevitable would come to pass in 1996, the two quickly began to implode once more. But that's a story for another time. If you really want to hear more about the Kiss reunion, I urge y'all to either encourage more of your friends to sign up for my Patreon, as this video hopefully will demonstrate it's worth it, or point them towards my YouTube channel. I'll do a deep dive series on Kiss in the 90s if I reach either 1,000 patrons or 50,000 YouTube subscribers by the end of 2023. But anyways, that'll be it for this video. Thank y'all for tuning in, and I'll see y'all next time. Bye-bye!